we are very excited to have Kaylee here today to discuss why minerals matter. Before we get into the presentation, I want to go through just a little housekeeping first. Just a reminder that this recording will be sent to everyone who registered, so if you have to leave early or want to watch it again, you will have access directly from your inbox after the webinar. The recording will also live on Fullscript's website, where you can access all of our past and upcoming webinars as well. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A box, and we will get to them during the Q&A period at the end. And with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Kaylee to take it away, and I will rejoin you closer to the end of the presentation for the live Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Get my screen up. All right. So I am super excited to be back presenting with Fullscript again. And today we're talking about why minerals matter. But if this is our first meeting, I just wanted to say hello. Like Sarah said, my name is Kaylee McDevitt. I am a registered dietitian, and I got into this field through an interest in sports nutrition and really thought that that's where I would be spending my time. But as fate would have it, I dealt with a whole bunch of hormone health symptoms while I was in school and doing my clinical internship that prompted a pivot toward women's health, mostly out of personal necessity first, and then realized how much of a need there was for that. So for the last 6 or 7 years, I've owned a private practice where my team and I help women overcome chronic hormone issues and digestive complaints. And I also run a practitioner training program a couple times a year to help nutrition practitioners effectively implement functional testing in practice. So a question to pose for you before we dive into today's content, and this really comes from the last decade of serving one-on-one clients in a variety of settings, really refining my process over the years and having the pleasure of mentoring and teaching fellow practitioners for the last 3. There is one aspect of client care that often gets missed that makes a humongous impact on improving outcomes. And whether your client's goals are to optimize fertility or overcome longstanding hormone health symptoms, improve digestion, or increase energy, there's one thing that we address first in every client case now, and that is mineral status. And when clients come to us to be a part of our practice, we personalize the types of testing we might recommend and what we're going to do over our 4-month program. But there's one exception to that, and that is that 100% of our clients will have their mineral status assessed and addressed as a result of our program. Because what we found over the years is that if we can address this in the beginning, this makes a big impact in how quickly we can start to see symptom improvement in our clients. And it's why I'm super passionate about talking about this particular topic. So what we've got on the agenda this afternoon is we're going to briefly go through, why minerals matter. I think they get glossed over quite a bit in favor of some more complex or flashy topics and protocols. So we're going to get on the same page for why this is an important root cause topic. We're going to talk about how to address mineral status, or assess mineral status, I should say, patterns to keep an eye out for in practice, and then strategies for mineral repletion that we like to call quick wins and can help get symptoms and energy on the right track pretty quickly. So first, what are minerals? So minerals, as the definition states, are just elements found in food and on the earth that are needed for our bodies to develop and function optimally. Now, a term that's often used interchangeably with minerals is electrolytes. And electrolytes are basically an umbrella term for particles that carry a positive or negative charge. So our minerals, when found in the blood, so when found in solution with a charge, are now electrolytes. So you'll often see minerals and electrolytes used on the same product label or food recommendations, and that's really the main difference. If your minerals are in the blood, so in a liquid medium and carrying a charge, they're electrolytes. Otherwise, they are considered minerals. And we've got 2 main categories of minerals. We've got macrominerals, which are ones that we need in larger quantities to support optimal function. These are sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, chloride, and sulfur. And then we have trace minerals, which are needed in smaller quantities in the human body. And this includes things like iron, zinc, copper, manganese, iodine, selenium, chromium, and molybdenum. And this is a nice graphic to just bring the topic of minerals back to the center. And if we think about what minerals do in the body, and minerals are enzyme cofactors, which means they kick off reactions that contribute to a lot of really important processes in the body. So things like supporting healthy bones and teeth, to regulating gene expression, to making sure we have healthy red blood cells that can carry and deliver oxygen well, supporting detoxification in the liver, producing digestive juices so we can not only keep out pathogens, but also absorb and break down the food and nutrients that we're eating. They're involved in hormone production and even the entry of those hormones into the cell. And then, of course, nerve transmission and muscle contractility. And now I want to walk you through a couple different main health pillars and just show examples of where minerals come into play with this so that we can tie this all back to the main theme. So first I want to start with digestion. And the symptoms on this slide are probably ones that you see often in your clients. I know we certainly do here. Chronic digestive symptoms. Maybe they've even seen a lot of other providers before you and really haven't seen a budge in those symptoms. Frequent pathogen infections. Either they can't clear the initial ones or they just keep picking things up, it seems. Maybe they've got a pattern of dysbiosis in their gut, if we've looked at stool testing or even just looked at symptoms. Maybe they've got a lot of nutrient deficiencies and it just doesn't make sense because their diet, lifestyle, and supplement routine would suggest otherwise. Or maybe they deal with chronic bloating or reflux. And one aspect that most of these symptoms have in common is the possibility of it being tied to low hydrochloric acid or low stomach acid production. Now, where minerals come into play here is that the parietal cells of your stomach lining require zinc and sodium chloride to make and secrete stomach acid. So if we don't have these fundamental building blocks for stomach acid, we're going to have a really hard time finding meaningful relief from these types of digestive symptoms or even long-standing nutrient deficiencies. And I should add that sufficient stomach acid production is root cause support for food sensitivities as well. When our clients start to have inappropriate immune responses to the proteins in food, there's usually a lack of HCl to blame for the fact that those proteins aren't adequately broken down. Now, moving on to the thyroid, we've got a couple of key minerals really involved in regulating this important gland's function. So first, iodine is required for the production of thyroid hormone. When we look at labs for thyroid, we're looking at T4 and T3, and the 4 and the 3 on those hormones correspond to the number of iodine molecules attached to tyrosine. So if we don't have iodine, we can't manufacture thyroid hormone. The thyroid gland gets iodide into the gland through the help of something called the sodium iodide symporter. So sodium is involved, and as is magnesium in that transport process. Selenium helps convert T4 to the active T3 and helps minimize oxidative stress during the conversion of iodide to iodine in the thyroid. And then copper, zinc, and iron also play a role in that T4 to active T3 conversion as well. So once again, no minerals, no healthy thyroid hormone production, conversion, or uptake. Now for sex hormones, zinc stimulates the pituitary gland to release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, these pituitary hormones are essential for ovulation to occur and for that whole menstrual cycle to happen as scheduled. Zinc deficiency in men is associated with a significant decrease in serum testosterone. Magnesium directly influences the conjugation of estrogen with glucuronic acid to allow us to excrete it in bile. So when we think of common women's health symptom complaints, estrogen dominance is something that is top of mind and we see quite often. And our ability to effectively offload estrogen from the body through our drainage and detox pathways is huge, and magnesium plays a role in that. And then iodine has a protective effect on breast cancer through modulating the estrogen pathway use. So maybe if you look at Dutch tests in your practice, and you can look at how estrogen metabolites are going down different pathways for different individuals, iodine can help with favorable, healthy metabolism of that iodine away from pathways that are associated with the estrogen-dominant cancers. Now for our adrenals, so thinking about clients with burnout or really high stress, high cortisol type A clients, sodium and potassium are both heavily utilized and regulated by the adrenal glands because they also make aldosterone. Low magnesium levels are reported in patients in clinical situations where catecholamines in circulation are elevated. So stress induces depletion of magnesium, zinc, calcium, and iron. So the theme of stress contributing to depletion of minerals is something that we'll come back to a few times in today's chat. Now for metabolism, so your client's ability to make energy at the cellular level, iron is necessary for oxygen transport throughout the body. Iron is also a component of complexes 1, 2, and 3 in the electron transport chain. Each molecule of ATP binds to a magnesium to become its biologically active form, so Mag-ATP, so it can be recognized and used as energy currency. Iodine, like we discussed, is essential for thyroid function, which governs the metabolic rate of our cells. Chromium assists in carb, lipid, and protein metabolism, so turning our food into energy. Phosphorus, of course, is a component of ATP. And then copper is a cofactor for cytochrome C oxidase as well. And then last but not least, taking it back to high school or college science classes and learning about the sodium-potassium pump that sits on the membrane of every cell. This pump, regulated by sodium and potassium, maintains cell membrane potential, so the charge across the gradient. It regulates the cell volume, so hydration of fluid in the cell, and plays a role in secondary active transporters to get things like glucose, amino acids, and nutrients into the cell. So the main theme I'm trying to drive home here is if our clients can't get nutrients into the cell, can't make energy, can't produce hormones, can't modulate stress or produce stomach acid, then they can't heal. So regardless of what they're coming to you for, healing requires energy. It requires transport of nutrients, and it requires healthy stress responses. So it doesn't matter how in-depth or advanced our protocol creation might be. If we've missed the mineral mark, we're not going to see progress, and it will either not progress or be really, really slow, frustrating progress with that client. So whether they're coming to you for hormone issues and infertility, or maybe it's weight loss resistance and chronic fatigue, or maybe they've got skin stuff going on like acne, eczema, and psoriasis, digestive issues, immune function that's poor, or chronic health conditions, mineral status matters, and I would argue should be first-line treatment. And jumping into complex protocols without supporting those minerals is equivalent to trying to force a car to run without gas in the tank. So the next logical question is, why are we in this pickle where mineral depletion is seemingly so common? And if you happen to serve a client population that maybe already eats really well, like it's not the standard American diet group, they're already on top of their food, maybe they're taking some good supplements, why should I care about this in their place? Well, there's three main things going on here. The first is stress increases mineral utilization and loss. We talked about that on the adrenal slide. You'll sometimes see it referred to as something called the magnesium burn rate if you get into some of the trainings on mineral and HTMA testing. So if we think about the modern humans today, we're inside, we're on computer screens, maybe we're under fluorescent lights, we've got 24/7 access to news and social media. We've got a lot of increased stress on our plate today, and that means we're using up and losing more of our minerals. On top of that, thanks to some poor soil management and agricultural problems, we are losing the mineral content of our soil. So the soil today, compared to 50 or 100 years ago, doesn't have nearly as much mineral content as it did before. So that means we could eat the same thing today, same plate of food that we did 50 years ago, and get less bang for our buck from it. And then lastly, we've got chemical inputs from things like pharmaceuticals, toxins in our air, food, and water that either compete for absorption with minerals, can actually chelate them, so bind to them and excrete them from the body, or just increase our demand. So the net result here is that we have an increased need for minerals due to stress and some of the chemical inputs in our environment, and we're also getting less from food. So we need more, and we're getting less from the food that we eat. And then there's a couple seasons of life where mineral depletion is even more likely to be found. So I wanted to put these on your radar. Pregnancy is a big time of mineral depletion, particularly if you serve women in the postpartum period. Dr. Robert Thompson has a book called The Calcium Lie that was a great read, and he estimates that per each pregnancy, a woman loses about 10% of her mineral supply. And then during breastfeeding, we're also losing more minerals that way too. So pregnancy, postpartum, and breastfeeding would be big times to have eyes on mineral repletion. If someone's had chronic digestive issues, and we have reason to believe that maybe absorption has been poor long-term, if you work with clients with eating disorders or clients that have just been chronic dieters, mineral depletion is much more likely, both from lack of intake and also stress on the body. Endurance athletes or competitive athletes of any type, just people that have a lot of physical output and a lot of sweat. If you have clients that are recovering from major illness or surgery or are in an acutely stressful season of life, these would all be times where that mineral depletion is going to be much more likely. So next I want to talk about how to assess this in our clients if we're suspecting this might be a direction we should go. So first we can look at signs and symptoms. You don't necessarily have to test for this. And I will say from testing all of our clients' mineral status, we've yet to have a client come in without some need for some mineral support, largely because of that predicament of the modern human that we just discussed. But some of the things to help turn a light bulb on in your mind as you're listening to client symptoms: fatigue, muscle cramps or twitches, restless leg syndrome as well, headaches and migraines, poor heat tolerance, irregular heartbeats, water retention or puffiness, digestive symptoms, brain fog, sluggish thyroid function, persistent low stomach acid, poor stress resilience, so they feel like they just get completely knocked down by stress, constipation, peeing constantly or waking to pee. That's a really big one. We'll often hear from our clients at first that they're getting up 2, 3, 4 times a night to pee. We start working on minerals and that totally resolves. And then of course, excessive thirst or drinking tons of water. I think it's hopefully not a trend anymore, but at least was for the past couple of years of just drinking like ridiculous quantities of water, like people bringing around gallon jugs of water each day. And if we're getting plain water without minerals, it's just going to go right through us. So this is the same group of people that's typically always peeing and waking up to pee at night as well. Now, if we want to have some lab data to back it, our preferred way of assessing this in our practice is the HTMA test, or hair tissue mineral analysis. And that's what we're going to look at some examples of throughout the rest of our call. We'll talk about how that test is done, what it's looking at, and what we can extract from it. But we'll also look at this with some blood work as well. And we can look at electrolytes in the blood, so our sodium, potassium, chloride. We look at magnesium, zinc, copper, iron, phosphorus in blood work as well. And that's really helpful if we're looking at it alongside an HTMA, so we can see what's happening in the blood and what's happening in the tissues at the same time and create a nice big picture there. So if you are new to HTMA testing, this is an analytical test which looks at the mineral content of the hair to give an indication of mineral status and toxic metal accumulation following long-term or acute exposure. And there's some big benefits to looking at this through the hair. One is that this is a really easy sample to take. So we're cutting a hair sample close to the scalp to get recent data. This can be done at home. It's painless. There's no blood draw. There's no special handling requirements when this gets shipped back out to the lab, and it's also extremely cost effective. This is the lowest cost lab that we use in our practice, and we get the most out of it. The HTMA test, because we're looking at tissue level, is giving us information about intracellular activity, which we're not going to be able to see in blood work, for example. And this is essentially giving us a blueprint of the biochemistry occurring during that period of hair growth, which is about 3 months for the length of the sample that we're looking at. So much like we say hemoglobin A1C is a better reflection of long-term glycemic control in blood work, because we get about a 3-month average, HTMA is that for minerals. So when we look at blood work and we look at electrolyte levels, that's telling us about that moment in time, whereas an HTMA tells us what do the last 3 months look like. And it's not going to be fluctuating based on short-term changes in hydration, food, or supplements. And mostly an HTMA is telling us what does our client's stress looked like for the last 3 months, and what has their unique compensation for that stress looked like. And I'll explain more what I mean on this. So I'm going to walk you through each of the sections here. Now, we're not going to go super in depth on the interpretation, but I want to go in depth enough that we're on the same page with the information we can extract so that our case examples make some sense here. But essentially, when we look at an HTMA result, these are the sections that we get. And first and foremost, in the upper right-hand side, we get a metabolic type. Now, these can either be slow or fast, and you'll see numbers 1 through 4 next to each of them that help tell us if different body systems are in sync or out of sync. So mostly this metabolic type tells us about their state of stress and how their nervous system, thyroid, and adrenals are keeping up with demand. So in this client example, that slow metabolic type is telling us that they're largely in the parasympathetic nervous system state. So this tends to be a lower energy state, probably not a whole lot of get up and go in their day-to-day routine. This is common after a period of stress. So we're kind of in the burnout phase of that. And that 1 next to it tells us that all body systems are moving at the same pace. So our nervous system, our thyroid, and adrenals are all running a little bit slower. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that there's weight management issues. Some of our clients see that metabolic type name and they think it means fast or slow metabolism. It definitely can be correlated with that because we're looking at energy production, but mostly this is telling us about state of the nervous system and how well we're able to move metals around the body. Next is our nutritional elements box, and this is going to give us a quick stress assessment and a look at nutritional mineral status. So it's probably pretty faint on your screen, but there's a midline in this white section here, and that's where we want to see most minerals hanging out optimally. So if we want to do a quick visual stress assessment on our clients, if we see a lot of minerals way above that midline, that's telling us more of a acute or active stress response phase. Whereas if we see most of the minerals hanging out below the line, like we do in this client, that's more of a depleted burnout side of the stress spectrum. And then we spend most of our time really workshopping these first 4 minerals. So calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium, as you'll come to find, influence a lot of how different body systems work and set the tone for what the rest of our minerals are up to. In the pink section, we have information on heavy metals. And this is showing us heavy metals being excreted in the hair. So this is different than seeing this in blood work or in the urine. And it's actually good to see a little bit of activity in this box because we know modern humans have exposure to heavy metals. And what's important is that we're able to offload those from the body and that they're not staying put. So generally speaking, we're not putting someone on a heavy metal detox protocol as a result of this test. We're looking at if it's a high level, can we look at sources of exposure? Can we maybe incorporate some water filtration or make some changes to personal or household care products? And really just making sure that their detox and drainage pathways are supported and open. And then first and foremost, that their foundational minerals are in good shape, because our best offense for heavy metals is a really good defense. And that is minerals occupying those receptor sites and not leaving them available for heavy metals. And then next is the significant ratios. And I think this is probably the coolest section of the HTMA because it helps connect the dots between what's happening with our minerals in different body systems. So the ratio between specific minerals can tell us about the nervous system or the thyroid or even blood sugar control. And with this client example here, that first ratio, the calcium to phosphorus, is the nervous system ratio. So a high bar here, which we want these at midline as well, is what gave this client a slow metabolic type designation. So this is that parasympathetic, usually lower energy type of state. That next bar over, sodium to potassium, is the stress and vitality ratio. And when this is elevated like it is here, this is a client that probably has a fair amount of stress going on. And that's probably what contributed to that depletion in the first place. And then the calcium to potassium ratio is the thyroid ratio. And when it is elevated, like it is in this client case, this means they're likely having a hard time getting thyroid hormone into the cell because they lack enough potassium around to do it. So this is where you can have clients with hypothyroid type symptoms, but maybe their blood work looks great. And this is one of the reasons for that cellular hypothyroid, which we wouldn't pick up in blood work and can really be optimized by supporting that potassium. And then the last one I want to mention, because it is so commonly low in clients that we serve, is sodium to magnesium ratio. And this is our adrenal and resilience measurement here. And it is common. In fact, I think about 95% of our clients have a really, really low adrenal ratio when we first start working together. And this is a client that has dealt with a lot of stress, is pretty depleted, and just doesn't have much resilience to stress anymore. The littlest things knock them down. Maybe they get sick easily, just really not having that resilience that they're longing for. So HTMA testing really shows us what the state of their stress has been for the last roughly 3 months and what their stress signature is. And what I mean by that is all of us on this call today could experience the same stressful event, but we're all going to have different reactions to that from a mineral standpoint. Some of us are going to lose certain minerals. Some of us are going to increase utilization of certain minerals. And we're all going to have a pretty unique stress signature. And what's cool about running an HTMA is you can learn that about yourself, or your client can learn that about themselves. So they know the next time inevitably life has some stress for them, maybe they can double down on magnesium. They can get more intentional sodium and potassium in, for example. An HTMA test can tell us, are they more on the ramped up side of stress, so more of that acute stress, or more of the chronic burnout side of the stress spectrum? It can tell us how cellular thyroid function is looking, what their ability to move metals around looks like. How is their energy and vitality? How's their digestive capacity? And are they stuck in sympathetic, fight or flight, or parasympathetic, rest and digest? So a couple patterns and presentations to look for in your clients, and we'll talk about it from an HTMA perspective, but also symptoms and personality traits in case you're not using lab data. So the first type is chronic stress, or just a really, really depleted client. Now this feels and looks like exhaustion, poor stress tolerance, slow or very limited progress on protocols, even if they've been super compliant, and possibly poor tolerance to magnesium. So we see this most often in this particular type. And on an HTMA, you'll see that sodium and potassium are lower than magnesium. And that's a clue that they might not tolerate magnesium well. And it's always frustrating for these clients because they've read, magnesium is so great for stress. I'm going to sleep like a baby. It's going to solve all my problems. And then they take some magnesium and they actually feel the opposite. They feel more anxious, more restless. They might have some muscle twitches. They might have some issues with sleep. And that's typically if sodium and potassium need some support first, because all of these minerals operate in relationship with one another. It's really common to see this kind of pattern in postpartum clients because of that mineral depletion and just stress and life change. It's common in clients that have had a lot of health stuff going on, and maybe they've been on the practitioner merry-go-round and doing a lot of protocols and a lot of things, and persistent GI issues. So if someone has had a rough time with absorption, they typically are going to have low mineral status like this. So what can we do with clients that present that way, or with an HTMA that looks like this? First and foremost, we got to minimize those stress inputs that got them into this pickle in the first place. And we'll talk a bit about that later. We need a pretty aggressive but strategic repletion of those foundational minerals. So calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. And I say strategic because, how I mentioned, if sodium and potassium are quite low, sometimes tolerance to magnesium isn't there. So typically we'll start slow and low with that magnesium. We might leverage some topical options instead of just going for an oral supplement at first. Well, we give them some time with sodium and potassium repletion, and then we'll bring in more magnesium. And we might even need to support some cofactors that help with the retention of these minerals, like B6, like boron, or even a trace mineral, rubidium. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you might have clients that are really sympathetic nervous system dominant. This will look and feel like really wired and tired, poor sleep quality, tending toward anxiousness and irritability. They likely deal with some headaches, some allergies, some heart palpitations, and it's really common to see this in type A perfectionist type clients, high performance individuals, whether that means athletically or even in their career. Like CEOs often have HTMAs that look like this. And what you'll see on this HTMA is the opposite of the previous one. So sodium and potassium are quite a bit higher, whereas calcium and magnesium are quite low. And calcium and magnesium are our calming, flexible nervous system type minerals. So when they're low, we have a really hard time shifting out of fight or flight. And when calcium is low, we're much more likely to deal with histamine issues and allergies. And that's why you see that on the list of potential presentations. So for helping clients that are stuck in this state, of course, we have to minimize the stress inputs. And you'll notice they've got, kind of a moderate level of arsenic showing here. So minimizing stress inputs includes making sure we're minimizing sources of exposure to arsenic, or maybe employing some water filtration for their shower and drinking water. We can help them create some nervous system practices to help with that flexibility between sympathetic and parasympathetic. We're going to add in some calcium and magnesium to support to help with that flexibility in their nervous system and help them wind down. We'll continue to make sure they get sodium and potassium through their diet because those will continue to be important, though they may not need quite as aggressive a support. And then we're going to work on digestive basics. So when I say digestive basics, I mean like incorporating bitter compounds to get digestive juices flowing, taking a few deep belly breaths before meals to help get their nervous system ready for digestion, and then chewing really, really well. And the reason why this is on my radar with this client, in addition to the fact that high stress sympathetic dominance means digestion is typically compromised, you'll notice on this particular marker here, cobalt, there's 2 less than signs, which means that it was less than their detectable limit. Now, cobalt sits at the center of methylcobalamin, or B12, and B12 requires sufficient stomach acid for absorption. So we'll commonly see really bottomed out cobalt in cases of impaired digestive capacity. And that's definitely a fit for the symptoms this client came in with. So anytime we're seeing really bottomed out cobalt, we've got a clue that we need some digestion support in this client as well. Next, we've got sluggish metabolism clients. So this might be fatigue and constipation. So just everything's moving slow, weight loss resistance, brain fog, slow healing. Maybe they get a scratch or a paper cut and it just takes weeks for it to heal. Cold hands and feet. If they happen to be tracking basal body temperature, those tend to run low as well. Maybe some hair loss, some bone and dental issues. And it's common to see these with hypothyroid symptoms, or maybe even a diagnosis of hypothyroidism previously, and chronic dieters. So what do we do with sluggish metabolism? So always minimizing stress inputs, because that is how we stop the bleeding, so to speak. And in this client's case, it also means investigating the sources of exposure of aluminum and mercury for them, because those have popped up into sufficient enough range where we're wondering where that is coming from in their day-to-day life. This will look like aggressive support for potassium. So you'll notice in this particular client, their calcium is way high, potassium is quite low. And this means that that calcium-potassium ratio, or the thyroid ratio, is really elevated. And when this is this way, this means we're going to struggle to get active T3 into the cells. So regardless of how their blood work looked for their thyroid, they're going to have cellular hypothyroid symptoms until we get more potassium and regulate that calcium back to the bones and teeth. And that's where K2 can come in. K2 is really helpful at directing calcium to the bones and teeth. And when you have a client presentation like this, where we see a lot of tissue calcium, we know it's probably not in the bones and teeth. So you're likely to see things like stress fractures, osteopenia, a lot of dental cavities, until we can get that calcium where it belongs. This might mean pausing some vitamin D supplementation. It depends on what their vitamin D status is, but vitamin D is going to increase calcium retention, and it might be part of this accumulation in the tissues as well. And that's where finding D3 formulations that come with K2 can help safeguard against that. And then continued support for magnesium and dietary sodium. Magnesium is an interesting marker on an HTMA because although this is quite high here, it doesn't mean they're getting too much magnesium. It just means that they're likely losing it and using a lot of it. You'll remember that term magnesium burn rate that we talked about before. And with stress comes loss of magnesium. So now what do we do about this? If we have clients that fit the symptoms, or maybe we have lab data to support it. So even in the absence of testing, there are a lot of ways to safely support minerals in your clients. So I want to throw that out there in case maybe you don't run HTMAs in your practice yet or don't plan to. There's a lot that we can do here even without clinical data to support it. The first step with mineral support, which is often missed, but really essential, is we've got to stop the leak. So we've got to work with our clients to assess stress to change what we can change. Are we under eating? Is blood sugar bouncing all over the place all throughout the day? Is there something that's within our control that can allow us to chip away at that stress input for that client? Can we help them build resilient strategies for things that can't be changed? And maybe that's not something that we're doing for them, but maybe we're directing them to, nervous system, like brain retraining programs, or an app for some guided meditation, or maybe setting them up with a therapist or counselor, somebody that can help with the long-term processing of trauma and building of resilience. Can we clean up home and beauty products to make sure there aren't chemical insults there that are contributing to the loss of minerals? And then can we look through other potential contaminants and adjust those as possible? So this might be a look through prescription medications that they're on and the nutrient interactions. Discontinuing low quality supplements, which I know we're speaking together with Fullscript today, so that's not an issue for anybody here, but we don't know what our clients were coming in taking before being under our care. Looking at water quality and air quality for them as well. And so if we skip this step and we go right to getting more minerals in them, and we don't patch up these holes, it's equivalent to trying to fill up a bucket that has a bunch of holes in it still. We're always going to be chasing our tail, and we're going to still see pretty sluggish improvement until we get this patched up for them. From there, I like to start with food. And I think this is one of the most fun things about working with minerals, and why it works so well to do this at the beginning of a client program is it's often really simple stuff, and it's things we can add in versus things that we're taking away from them, which is so common on health journeys. So the first thing is we're going to want to swap refined salt for quality unrefined salt that hasn't been stripped of all of the trace minerals. We don't want salt that's just giving them sodium. We want that whole array of trace minerals along with that sodium. We want to prioritize potassium-rich foods. It's been my experience that potassium marker is the hardest to move. It takes the most intention. And we typically have to get, upwards of like 4,800 milligrams of potassium daily to start to see that really meaningfully change. And if we think about what foods contain the most potassium, it's pretty much our carbohydrates. It's our fruits and our root vegetables largely. So if we've got clients that are on a low carb intake, or maybe they have been for a long time, or maybe they've even been full blown keto, we probably have a lot to do with that potassium. And this might mean we have to liberalize that carbohydrate intake a bit to allow more sources. And then we're going to play around with some mineral rich foods, things like bone and vegetable broth, fruit and fruit juices, root vegetables, grass-fed liver, leafy greens, oysters, bee pollen, and even black beans would all be great examples of high mineral content foods. We also like to add in some mineral mocktails, or you might see them described as adrenal cocktails as well. And this is just a way to make a fun beverage that they can include, once or twice a day, depending on their need. And it's a way to get a pretty potent source of potassium, sodium, vitamin C, and magnesium together. And this is a pretty common recipe that we'll use. So 8 to 10 ounces of coconut water for potassium. We'll add in some salt for sodium and trace minerals. We'll add in a squeeze of lime for some vitamin C and flavor, and then add in some magnesium powder to get magnesium in them too. And then once we've got the plugging up the holes for mineral loss and the food squared away, we can start to layer on some helpful supplements to either provide a more therapeutic dose of specific minerals, or maybe provide cofactor support for some of the minerals we discussed. And typically we do start with food and mineral powders while we wait on testing data, because we're not getting a therapeutic dose from those and can build a foundation. And then we'll get more specific once we get the lab data back. So sodium, we've discussed, influences stomach acid production, maintains fluid balance and pH levels in the body. It's one regulator of blood pressure. It's regulated by adrenal output of aldosterone. We're typically talking about sodium repletion through food and electrolyte powders. I don't think at any point in my career have I given somebody like a salt capsule, but we might look at something like the adrenal cocktail powder, or pickleball cocktail is the name of their other electrolyte blend from Jigsaw. That we really love and find useful with clients, in addition to that quality salt like we mentioned. And then potassium is kind of the other side of the coin to sodium, to help regulate sodium status and blood pressure, maintains fluid balance and pH through being part of that sodium-potassium pump, plays a role in every single heartbeat through influence on nerve conduction, And low levels of potassium is even associated with making less insulin. So you might have a tendency toward blood sugar regulation issues in the absence of potassium. And once again, you'll see the same products here that we often use from Fullscript. The adrenal cocktail and pickleball cocktail are great like food-based powders that don't have additives or a lot of junky artificial sweeteners, and are making that a lot easier to incorporate in their diet. Magnesium, I think of all nutrients, this is probably the one that I talk about no matter the topic of talk I'm giving, because it's involved in so many different processes in the body. This is helping to combat stress in the day-to-day. Like we talked about with the metabolism piece, our body can't use or recognize ATP without magnesium attached to it. So this is a big connection to energy and vitality. We need it for converting vitamin D to the active form. There's a lot of magnesium studies looking at helping with period pain and just dysmenorrhea overall, even reducing severity of menstrual migraines. Just big fan of magnesium. And we typically are needing pretty hefty doses as tolerated with our clients. And here are a couple favorites from Fullscript that we like to leverage. This is a topical magnesium oil. That's a great option if we're concerned about bowel tolerance to magnesium, if we have reason to believe that they're not tolerating oral magnesium well, maybe sodium and potassium are low, or we just want one less supplement. Topical is a great option. And then capsule magglycinate, and then this is a drink mix called MagSoothe. Both of these are in the magnesium glycinate form. Calcium is, of course, helpful for healthy bones and teeth. It also helps regulate that flexibility of the nervous system. We use calcium in insulin production. It has an inhibitory effect on thyroid hormone, so that balance between calcium and potassium is really the key there. It regulates histamine release from mast cells and helps magnesium carry that ATP. Typically, I'm looking for food options for calcium repletion. That might be things like more dairy or leafy greens. We can DIY some eggshell powder. You can purchase bone meal powder or even pearl powder as an option for support in times of low calcium. And then copper and zinc. So these two support ATP production. They help with the regulation of iron in the body. They have antifungal and antibacterial properties. They maintain a healthy immune system, involved in the conversion of T4 to active T3 and in the synthesis of collagen. So once again, I do like food-based options when available. And two that Fullscript carries are both by the brand Smidge, and one is oyster zinc and one is desiccated beef liver. And the beauty of food-based supplements like this is that they come with not just zinc and copper, but an array of cofactors and supporting nutrients that really help with absorption and utilization. And then trace minerals. So though these are needed in smaller quantities than the macro minerals, they do complete important functions in the body by supporting the absorption and utilization of those macro minerals. They catalyze different enzyme reactions and participate in cellular metabolism too. And adding some trace mineral drops to water is especially important if our clients are filtering their water through means that do strip these minerals. So things like distillation or reverse osmosis. We don't want to have completely mineral devoid water. So sometimes we've got to add it back in after we strip the things we don't want out. I really like Trace Minerals Research product line. They've got concentrates, trace mineral drops, and Utah Sea minerals. Really like and use. And then last but not least, you might need to lean on some additional support for mineral balance that's not minerals directly. K2 is a really common one in this realm to help support that calcium homeostasis, getting that calcium back to bones and teeth in the instance of high tissue calcium. B6 can be helpful for keeping potassium and magnesium in the cells, especially helpful if we see low potassium and magnesium levels or that really high magnesium loss picture. And then boron is a trace mineral that can help keep calcium in the bones and teeth, can keep magnesium inside the cell, and especially helpful with high calcium or low magnesium on an HTMA. And then I just wanted to make you aware of this because I was late to the game, but there are a ton of wonderful resources in Fullscript's resource library that you can directly attach to client recommendations and supplement prescriptions. And there's some really great nuggets in there as it relates to minerals, one being this magnesium-rich food source PDF. I was going to create something similar in Canva and then realized this already existed in Fullscript. It's easy to attach to their protocol and gives them some additional ideas. There's some great recipes and even condition-specific PDFs in there too. So definitely be sure to leverage those. And then where does mineral work fit in the context of a client program? So this is an example of a client that came in. We did some stool testing. We found things like H. pylori and Candida, and we had a good, 4 to 5 month long protocol of work to get through. But what you'll notice is that we start with those foundational habits and mineral support right out of the gates. And that's continued throughout the duration of their program. And that mineral support is something that our clients will continue after they're done working with us too. So we start with that in the beginning. We start with basics. As lab data comes in, we can get more specific. We continue it throughout. And then mineral support becomes a long-term strategy for them for energy and stress resilience overall. And then lastly, what are some signs and symptoms of knowing that you and your clients are on the right track with incorporating some more minerals? So first and foremost is improved energy. And the fun thing about all of these is that they typically happen pretty quickly once we start getting more minerals into their day-to-day. So improved energy, maybe they're not having that afternoon crash anymore, which would be great. No longer waking up to pee at night is a huge one, and typically is within just the first couple of days of working on this. They're sleeping through the night. They're not waking up to pee. They're not peeing constantly throughout the day. Less headaches, less migraines, less puffiness and fluid retention. Improved digestion, because now we've got the building blocks for our stomach acid. And then no longer excessively thirsty, not feeling like they're a bottomless pit for fluids, because once we introduce the right minerals into the mix, now we can actually be hydrated at the cellular level instead of just drinking all day and peeing all day. And the really fun thing about all of these is how quickly they tend to happen once we implement those really simple mineral strategies, whether it's just food or leveraging some supplements too. And it's another reason for starting here while we're waiting complexity in their protocol for the rest of their care, because those quick wins early on in a client program are really, really important to keep morale and engagement and buy-in high. So I hope that you found some little nuggets that you can incorporate in your client care. And, HTMA testing was the most recent lab test we added to our practice a couple years ago. And we just saw a remarkable improvement in how quickly we could get our clients moving in the right direction, and really solved the mystery that we had had for years of why certain clients would improve fast, some would improve slowly, or maybe not at all despite compliance. And it pretty much always comes back to minerals, because minerals run our enzymes and our enzymes do really important stuff for us. So I will open it up to questions for our last 10 minutes together. But if you found this helpful, I'd love to connect with you. Feel free to say hi over on Instagram at KayleeRD. And you can find my website of the same name, KayleeRD.com. I run a practitioner mentorship program twice a year, which is a 12-week live training on how to effectively implement functional testing like HTMA in practice. And more important than just incorporating it in practice, how do we expertly craft protocols and evolve them over a comprehensive program with our clients? So it's super fun. We get really nerdy. And if I can ever be of assistance to you, you know where to find me. With that, I will stop my screen share and open it up to some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kaylee. We did get a few questions come through during the presentation, so we'll go ahead and get to those first. The first question is, what is your opinion on copper supplementation? There is a new theory on deficiency of copper causing multiple issues that is currently circulating. Do you have any opinion on this?
Yeah, I mean, copper is super, super important. We're going to notice it if we are truly deficient. I would personally be wary of supplementation of copper directly in the absence of testing. And I would want to see it in blood work and in an HTMA to confirm that big picture of blood and tissue. If we found that it was truly deficient in both places, then yeah, there's a time and place for some copper supplementation. My personal philosophy is to start with food and food-based options and then move to more specific supplements if we need to. But bigger picture would also be looking at that whole constellation of minerals too. So nothing happens in isolation in the body. So if copper is deficient, there's probably some other stuff that needs support. And generally speaking, we have, calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium to support as well.
Great. The next question is, what are your thoughts on CMOS?
Oh yeah, CMOS. That's a good, food-based option for trace minerals and for iodine specifically. So definitely a time and place for that. It's not something I've utilized personally, but we've had some clients use that instead of things like kelp or seaweed. So it can be a good food-based mineral support.
Great. And what is the best program or company for a nutritionist to become certified to offer HTMA testing in their practice?
So depending on what your nutritionist certification is, you may already be good to go there. The lab company we use for HTMA is called Trace Elements. They're based out of Texas. So what I would do in your case is just give them a call and ask. They'll know what certifications they can accept and which ones they don't. So you may already be good to go. If you're not, a couple common certification programs that would give you that access, probably the most common is the FDN, so Functional Diagnostic Nutritionist. Will give you lab ordering options. And then there's a couple other third-party lab companies like Avexia, for example, that'll partner with non-licensed practitioners and give you access to ordering labs. So there's a lot of routes to that just beyond the certification.
Great. The next question is, if you can please touch on copper toxicity. Why does it happen?
Yeah, so similar to our copper deficiency conversation, this is definitely a possibility, and copper is a big deal. So high and low is going to present with some symptoms. Now, some of the reasons for copper accumulation in the body, very common postpartum. We're supposed to pass on a big portion of our copper to the developing baby, but if we are deficient in vitamin A, retinol, for example, we're not going to have a good handoff there, and we can sometimes keep too much of that copper. There's some really interesting research on postpartum copper accumulation and postpartum depression. Copper IUDs and just hormonal birth control in general tends to skew the copper balance because there's an affinity between estrogen and copper. And then even copper pipes, which are pretty common depending on where you live, might mean we get quite a bit of exposure to copper. Now, I will say, without this being its own hour-long conversation in and of itself, copper toxicity isn't as simple as it seems. Typically, it means we can't access the copper we have because of a lack of cofactors. So our approach is generally not to try to get rid of all of this copper, but how do we make that bioavailable to the client? Vitamin A has a lot to do with that. Vitamin C from food sources does that well, and then balance of those foundational minerals. So coming back to the calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium.
Great. Next question is, are there any concerns with bone organ products and toxins and metals?
Yeah, so you're always going to want to check your sourcing for this stuff for sure, because whatever that particular animal that it was collected from was exposed to is going to be present in that product. So, thankfully, if you're doing this through Fullscript, they've done the vetting process for us, which makes that really easy. If you're going from a brand not on Fullscript, you just want to do your due diligence, read about their sourcing policies, the farms they're getting this from, how those animals were raised and what they were fed. So a little bit more legwork if you're going rogue with it, but it's possible to find good options.
Great. Can you speak to why you might not recommend supplements for calcium repletion? I've heard a few MDs lately speaking about strictly moving away from calcium supplementation and instead using magnesium mainly and other minerals like boron for osteoporosis support.
Yeah, I think HTMA testing was really eye-opening for me in this regard because we could be giving a client with osteoporosis or osteopenia a calcium supplement, but it could just be going to the tissues and not the bones and teeth. And it's actually pretty dangerous to have calcium where it doesn't belong, like tissue calcification, artery calcification. So calcium in and of itself isn't the solution. The solution is, can we get that calcium to the bones and teeth? And a lot of times it's not a lack of calcium, it's just hanging out in the wrong spot. So things like boron and magnesium and K2, for example, can help that individual take the calcium they have and move it where it belongs. So a lot of times we don't actually need supplemental calcium to correct a bone issue. It's just a matter of accessing that calcium with the supportive nutrients you mentioned.
Thank you. And the next question, we'll try and get one or two more in. Do you recommend taking both the trace mineral drops in addition to the adrenal powder for your clients?
It depends on their water filtration. So if we have reason to believe that there's mineral stripped water, like RO, without that mineral additive last step that you can add on to it, or distillation, for example, then we'll add trace mineral drops whenever they're having plain water. And I would do that in addition to like an adrenal cocktail. If they've got mineral rich water already, it just would be a little redundant and unnecessary.
Great. And how does mineral supplementation change over time, or does it stay the same even after improvement?
So your foundational minerals that we've talked about quite a bit will typically be similar long-term, but maybe just less frequent. So an example of this, if somebody comes in really depleted and symptomatic, we might be a little bit more aggressive with that sodium and potassium and magnesium input to get those levels up while we're working on the stressors that got them into that place in the beginning. And then over time, they're not going to need that same level of nutrient support because their tank is topped off, so to speak. So we might drop that to once a day instead of twice a day. We might scale back on the dose of magnesium. The nice thing about this, though, is it's pretty self-correcting. If you're just listening to how you feel when you're including these, it'll be a pretty big clue to how much you need, if you need an extra one, if you need less. And then your clients can kind of titrate that for themselves as they navigate the different seasons of life.
Thank you. And the last question I think that we'll be able to get to today is, how have you seen high daily caffeine intake affect mineral levels? What supplements can support clients who do not want to change their caffeine intake?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if we think about what caffeine's doing, it's essentially putting like the foot on the gas of our metabolism, right? Like we're getting that surge of cortisol, we're getting the energy from it. And we use minerals to create energy. So if we're using a lot of caffeine, our mineral utilization is probably high too. In addition to that, caffeine is a diuretic. So we're probably losing some minerals that way as well. So if someone's using a lot of caffeine, my first question is, why is this necessary? I mean, I love coffee myself. I think there's like a great ritual to having a cup of coffee. I'm not against it, but we shouldn't need it. So if someone is needing a lot of caffeine, that speaks to an energy deficiency elsewhere. And supporting minerals is actual support for energy production, actual gas in the tank, whereas caffeine is artificial, right? Like we're pressing on the gas, but we're not restoring the status. So if that's a non-negotiable for them, I would just be even more intentional with getting more minerals in them. And I'd be willing to bet that their reliance on caffeine will go down as mineral status improves, and they might surprise you and just not need it as much anymore.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Kaylee. It was a really good presentation. And as I said previously, there will be, the recording will be available for everybody who attended. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out after.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for spending the afternoon.
Thank you.